Good afternoon. Today's webinar on wildlife conservation in China with Jim Harkness is about to start. I'm Joan Brzezinski and director of the Minnesota China Center, University of Minnesota China Center. We are delighted to have you here joining us today. Thank you for supporting this webinar series and for your support of the China Center. Your generosity makes these programs possible, and we invite you to support our mission and give to the China Center through the link on your webinar announcement and on our website. At the end of the program, we will answer your questions that you submit through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have technical difficulties or need help, please use the chat function and someone will respond, but we won't answer the Q&A or the questions through the chat function. Also, I will just add a little note here to tell you that in the preparation for today's webinar, Jim was experiencing a little bit of internet instability. So if he has a moment where we need to catch him, please be patient. So we'll get started. China's rich biodiversity is among the largest in the world. China's biodiversity, as is in the case of many other countries, faces multiple threats from habitat loss due to deforestation and pollution, increased human activities, and climate change. The recent coronavirus has brought China's management of wildlife into focus. I'm delighted to present a discussion on these topics with Jim Harkness. In 1976, Jim, at the age of 14, was chosen to be the first US student on a friendship delegation to visit the People's Republic of China. A few years later, an ornithology class field trip introduced him to the International Crane Foundation, and his interest in wetland conservation work in China began. Jim lived in China for 16 years, working on rural development, natural resource management, and environment as an executive director of the World Wildlife Fund in China, and as the Ford Foundation's Environment and Development Program Officer in China. He's fluent in Chinese, has written and spoken frequently on China and sustainable development, and has served as advisor to the World Bank, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, and he currently serves as interim China country director for the National Geographic Society. Please welcome Jim Harkness.
Thanks, Joan, and hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and now I'm going to share my screen with you so we can have a presentation and you can see something other than me during my presentation. Are we sharing?
Not yet. There you go.
All right, I'll get started then. It's really fitting that I was invited to give this presentation by the University of Minnesota because the University of Minnesota Summer Chinese Language Program in Tianjin at Nankai University played an important part in the unusual series of events that set me on a path to a career in wildlife conservation in China. I grew up in Minneapolis, but was fortunate to attend a public high school that offered Chinese language way back in the early 1970s. And after that amazing trip to China that Joan mentioned, I continued studying Chinese when I started college at the University of Wisconsin, even though I really wanted to be an ornithologist, not a linguist. When I was a freshman, I managed to talk my way into a graduate seminar on avian ecology, and we took a field trip to visit the International Crane Foundation, a small nonprofit based in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and headed by MacArthur Genius Grant awardee, George Archibald. During our visit, the person who was showing us around said something to the effect that if any of us really wanted an exciting thesis topic, we should study birds in China. But she then paused and said, but of course, you'd have to be able to speak Chinese to do that. Well, everybody else in the group laughed, but of course I was in the back with my hand up like, me. I left my name and my phone number, and a few weeks later, Dr. Archibald called me up and I began working as a volunteer for ICF, translating bird lists and other documents in Chinese as best as I could with my beginning Chinese skills. When he found out that I was going to Tianjin on the Minnesota Nankai program, George asked me if I would be willing to hand deliver an envelope for him to a scientist in Beijing. China is home to 7 of the world's 14 species of cranes, and ICF was hoping to be one of the first foreign organizations allowed into the country to do conservation work. The person I was supposed to find was their first contact in China, and George had something for him that he apparently didn't want to send through the mail. So I said, sure. China was just emerging from the Cultural Revolution at that time, though, and there was still a lot of suspicion of foreigners and a lot of restrictions on our travel and movements. So I wasn't actually allowed to travel to Beijing on my own. I had to wait all summer until finally in August, when our university's foreign student office took us on a sightseeing trip to Beijing. In between the Temple of Heaven and the Forbidden City, I slipped away from the group and I found my way to the Beijing Natural History Museum. Back among dusty display cases filled with butterflies and beetle specimens, I handed a fat manila envelope to an elderly scientist in a gray Mao suit. We were both nervous, him probably because contact with foreigners, as I said, was viewed with a tremendous amount of suspicion at that time. And I was nervous because he was nervous. All of a sudden, I also realized that I didn't actually know what was in the envelope I was delivering. When he looked around one last time before carefully starting to tear open the end of the envelope, I was half expecting, microfilm or maps of US missile locations to fall out. But instead, and to my relief, he pulled out a couple of scientific papers about crane taxonomy and a half a dozen glossy photos of different crane species. Then he looked around again, quickly shook my hand in thanks, and said in Chinese, "You speak Chinese very well," which actually wasn't true, and then disappeared. And that was my introduction to wildlife conservation in China. Over the past 40 years, China has experienced Are you with me? Over the past 40 years, China has experienced explosive economic growth and social change, all of which has come with terrible costs to its natural environment. But there have always been people like that scientist at the Beijing Natural History Museum who have worked to save China's natural heritage. And their efforts, their successes and failures are what I want to talk about today. Now, the vast majority of those people are Chinese, but since I'm the one telling the story, I'm sure I'll end up overrepresenting the role of foreign groups like the ones I've worked with. But I think that's okay, because outside scientists and conservationists have played a role. And I also believe that we should all be supporting China's efforts to protect its rich biodiversity, because it's truly part of our global shared natural heritage. I know that there's a lot of wildlife in China and far too many issues for me to cover in an hour, so I'll try to limit my presentation so we have plenty of time for questions afterwards. But I do want to quickly just check with our moderator. Hi, Ann, can you let me know if everybody can still hear me?
I think we're doing fine, Jen.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Mm-hmm.
Well, listen, as Joan mentioned in her introduction, China is a mega diversity country. It has the third largest number of plant and animal species on the planet. An important reason for this is the country's topography, and I hope you can see my cursor because I'm making a little circle around this area in the southwest of China at the east end of the Himalayas, where there are a series of tall mountain ridges and deep river valleys. It's the origin of most of the large rivers in Asia, the Yellow, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Salween. They're all jammed together in this series of high mountains and deep valleys. During successive ice ages over the past few million years, these deep, warm, wet valleys acted as a sort of a refuge for numerous species of plants and animals that had been found all over Eurasia, but were wiped out everywhere else by the advance of the glaciers. This topography also promoted the evolution of new species. Oh, shoot. I seem to have lost my sound briefly. I was saying that during successive ice ages over the past few million years, these deep, warm valleys acted as a refuge for numerous plant and animal species that had been found all over Eurasia in ancient times, but were wiped out everywhere else by the advance of the glaciers. This topography also promoted the evolution of new species by isolating subpopulations that then grew further and further apart genetically until they became separate species entirely. As a result of this geology and natural history, China, which is only about the size of the United States, has twice as many plant and animal species as the US and Canada combined. It also has a huge diversity of ecosystems, from tropical forests to glaciers to coral reefs to deserts, and of course the highest point on the planet, Mount Everest. So when we talk about wildlife in China, of course, we're not just talking about pandas. And all those plants and animals are sharing a national territory with the world's largest human population and an economy that has grown by double digits for much of the period I'm discussing. So you can see the huge challenges that China's conservationists have been up against. Wildlife conservation in modern China. And I'm back. Wildlife conservation in modern China really doesn't start until after Mao's death in 1976. Under Mao, nature was seen either as an enemy to be tamed or as a stock of resources to fuel China's industrialization. Vast forests were chopped down during the Great Leap Forward to provide fuel for a failed scheme to build steel mills in villages. And forested hillsides were stripped bare in the 1960s and 70s so that grain terraces could be built as part of a different campaign. Wild animals were seen as pests. Wild animals were seen as pests that spread disease and compete with humans for food. So there was a massive campaign to kill sparrows that ended up leading to a wholesale slaughter of wild birds. After Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping rose to leadership and initiated what has become known as the Reform and Opening period. As I'm sure you know, Deng gradually loosened restrictions on private economic activities and reconnected China to the global economy. Under Deng, China took the first serious steps toward conservation of biodiversity. But as they did so, the economic forces he unleashed also brought new and greater pressures on nature. Like Mao, Deng thought of nature as a raw material for human use, but he felt that it had to be managed more sustainably. And those failed campaigns that had denuded China's forests were not just bad for wildlife, but they also brought erosion and desertification and hurt agricultural production. In response, Deng committed China to massive tree planting programs to try to stabilize soil and water, especially in North and West China. They mobilized huge numbers of people and resources, but were poorly designed, and there was often no care for the trees once they were planted. So in the end, little was accomplished from a huge expenditure of effort. A Chinese forester once told me that if all those trees had actually survived, they would have covered the whole country 10 times over. This kind of simplistic engineering solution to ecological problems was a holdover from the old command economy. And it wasn't until the 1990s that a less heavy-handed top-down approaches started to gain acceptance. The signal achievement for wildlife protection in China during this era was the huge increase in protected areas. And it happened due to the work of scientists like the man I had met in the Natural History Museum. Intellectuals had been attacked during the Cultural Revolution, many of them sent off into internal exile or forced labor. But the post-Mao leadership rehabilitated science and expertise, and in 1979 passed major forest and environmental protection laws. In 1980, 2,500 botanists and zoologists were sent out across the country in search of unique and threatened species and ecosystems in need of protection. And by 1981, 100 new nature reserves had been established. Between 1980 and 1998, the number of protected areas in China mushroomed from a few dozen to over 800. At a time when it was still a very poor country with lots of people to feed, and one with a growing demand for natural resources to fuel its development, China had made a remarkable commitment to preserve nature for future generations. in the economic boom years of the 1980s and 1990s. People in China who had money were looking for things to buy, and people who wanted more money were looking for things to sell. And loosening of restrictions on economic activity meant that supply chains could extend from the poorest mountain village or the remotest corner of the Tibetan Plateau all the way to Shanghai or Guangzhou or beyond. As a result, wildlife trade exploded, and a lot of it was for export. In 1987, for instance, a large shipment of Chinese musk, which is used for making colognes and is extracted from the glands of the musk deer, was confiscated in Japan, and authorities estimated that it corresponded to 100,000 animals killed. In the 1980s and 90s, demand skyrocketed in South Asia and elsewhere for a cloth called chatouche, which is said to be many times softer than the finest pashmina shawl, and is especially prized among high caste women in North India. But chatouche doesn't come from sheep or goats. It's actually made from the undercoat of the Tibetan antelope, which is pictured here. And the antelope actually needs to be killed in order to extract it. Hundreds of thousands were shot and skinned in scenes recalling the slaughter of North American bison in the 1800s, their hides smuggled over the border for processing. And where there had been 1 million Tibetan antelope on the high plateau in the early 20th century, there were just 75,000 left by the mid-1990s. The opening part of Reform and Opening refers to China's re-engagement, not only with the global economy, but its greater openness to the outside world in general. And one aspect of that was the entry of environmental organizations like WWF, ICF, and others starting in the 1980s. One of the earliest international projects that I want to talk about was the reintroduction of Père David's deer. Père David's deer is a small deer that historically lived in wetlands and marshes in the central Yangtze River Valley, but went extinct in the late 19th century. About 100 years later, though, Père David's deer reappeared in China. It turned out that a few of the deer had been captured in the 1800s alive and shipped to menageries in Europe for display. In 1985, the 14th Duke of Bedford was persuaded by WWF to donate a few dozen deer from his private herd at Woburn Abbey so that the species might be reestablished in China. At first, the deer were kept at a breeding farm outside of Beijing, but then they were transferred to enclosures in protected areas in their historic home along the Yangtze. There was a lot of concern at the time because they were descended from such a small captive population and had been out of their native habitat for so long that the deer would have physical problems from inbreeding or would have lost the ability to survive in the wild. But apparently the deer didn't know about that. They quickly escaped from the nature reserves where they had been resettled, sometimes swimming long distances in floodwaters, and they established new herds in other areas. There are now over 50 small herds of Père David's deer in and out of protected areas in the wild, and a couple thousand animals in various zoos and breeding centers in China. Another wetland species that has returned from the brink of extinction, thanks in part to international cooperation, is the crested ibis, which is pictured here. This ibis was once widespread in Northeast Asia, up into Russia and Korea, but due to habitat loss, hunting, and especially the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, by 1981, there were only 6 wild birds known, and they were all in Japan. They were actually captured in the hope that they could be protected and bred in captivity for reintroduction. But while Japan's last ibis were dying out, there had been a desperate search underway in China to try to rediscover the species in that part of its historic range. An ornithologist named Liu Yinzeng from the Chinese Academy of Science Institute of Biology had spent 6 years traveling on foot or by bicycle through the foothills of the Qinling Mountains in Shanxi province, asking farmers if they had seen the bird. And in May 1981, he found several of them, including a nesting pair. Now, the crested ibis is considered sacred in Japan, and after the bird was rediscovered in China, the Japanese government provided millions of dollars in support, as well as technical support, to Chinese conservationists to help this bird that had almost disappeared forever. Today, there are over 2,000 crested ibises in China, and in addition to an expanded area in the Qinling Mountains, there's a second wild population well established in Henan province at the Dongjai Nature Reserve. And ibises have even been reintroduced back into the wild in Japan. It's a good example of how a shared commitment to a higher cause can build bridges between countries that generally don't get along. Of course, not all cooperation went smoothly, which brings us to the giant panda. The giant panda. Saving the panda has been the highest profile conservation story in China and maybe in the world for a long time. But I bet that some of the things that you think you know about pandas are wrong. And there's a story behind that. Pandas, of course, are adorable. I mean, look at this guy. And so people will pay to see them in zoos. And they want to see them in pairs, even though actually pandas are solitary and would never wander around as couples. After the first pair was given by the Chinese government to the National Zoo, other American zoos decided they wanted a piece of the action. They offered to pay a rental fee to the Chinese government for the ability to exhibit pandas. And by the early 1990s, the trade was getting out of hand. I mean, you had pandas on display at, the auto show in Paducah. And that the authorities in the zoo community became really concerned. The problem was pandas are endangered. And according to international law, something called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, you can't trade an endangered species if it's going to hurt its chances for survival. And the question was, how is shipping pandas around the world good for the survival of that species? The American Zoo Association decided to declare a moratorium on these panda rentals in about 1991 in order to sort this situation out. And I was hired to work on this. It turned out, I learned that there was a fierce debate among zoos on this issue. Some said we really shouldn't bring over any more pandas because there's a danger that it might increase demand for more to be taken out of the wild. Another position was that pandas are critically endangered, kind of like the crested ibis. So we need to breed a lot of them in zoos so that we can then release them back into nature. And furthermore, this argument went, pandas are not very good at reproduction. So we need to bring them over to the United States where we have state-of-the-art endangered species breeding techniques that we can use to get them to have more little pandas. And this idea that pandas are bad at mating turned into a whole narrative that I'm sure you've heard of in the media about how pandas are an evolutionary dead end and the male panda's penis is a funny shape or it doesn't reach far enough. And basically, the species is a freak of nature that is only able to survive because of the heroic efforts of zoos to get them to reproduce. And the thing is, none of this is true. But it makes sense that some zoos would want to say it, because if exhibiting a pair of pandas is profitable, exhibiting a baby panda is like hitting the zoo lottery. So there was a strong commercial incentive to spread this idea about pandas being kind of a freak that needs help in order to breed. So the bottom line was, this is a way to justify sending more pandas to the US as a way to save the species so that it could be seen as a legal and acceptable practice. What we actually know is that pandas have absolutely no problem reproducing. They have a problem reproducing in zoos. And when you think about it, it makes sense. In the wild, field biologists have shown that pandas have about the same reproductive success as a lot of populations of wild black bears do. They really do just fine. The other issue that came up was this notion that we need to breed a bunch of them and then reintroduce them into the wild. Well, the real threats to pandas are not, related to their sexual technique. They were things like habitat destruction and hunting. And by focusing on having more pandas in zoos and doing things like showing them videos of other pandas mating so that they would realize what the right technique would be, people were taking attention away from this real challenge of saving the panda's habitat. Happily, the American Zoo Association did not try to press for a return to the rent-a-panda scenario. And they put safeguards in place to ensure that money raised from exhibiting pandas in zoos would be spent for conservation of pandas in the wild. As part of that process, in 1994, I had a chance to spend time in the field with park rangers and biologists. And as part of that, I was actually able to see a wild panda up close. There's nothing between me and this panda but some stalks of bamboo. And they are a bear, a big wild animal. It took us several hours of crawling on our hands and knees at about a 45-degree angle through thick bamboo groves on a very hot day in the Qinling Mountains to find this young panda. It had been fixed with a radio collar when it was younger and was somewhat acclimated to human presence. So the biologist I was with when we finally found the animal encouraged me to crawl up to it and offer it some bamboo to eat. And then, sure enough, the thing that it's sticking in its mouth right now is bamboo that I had just given it. And we were able to continue feeding it for about 20 minutes before it finally rolled over and disappeared into the forest. The unfortunate or sort of ominous thing about seeing it was the fact that the entire time we were watching it, we could hear axes chopping in the background because this panda had wandered out of protected areas and was on a logging company's land. So it was unfortunately in habitat that was very threatened at the time. But it was an incredible experience that I'll certainly never forget. Now, if the expansion of the protected area system was a major accomplishment in that early reform and opening period, one of the big challenges was operating all of those nature reserves in a country with almost 1.5 billion people. China's first few protected areas had gotten operating funds from the central government, but when the number of nature reserves grew into the hundreds, this was no longer supportable. So financial and management responsibility of most of these reserves was left in the hands of local governments, and this became a huge burden for them. Most nature reserves in China are in poor areas, where that same isolation that had slowed the destruction of nature had also served as a barrier to economic development. So local governments, desperate to feed their people and generate jobs, just couldn't take on the additional burden of staffing and protecting nature reserves. By 1994, it was reported that 1/3 of China's protected areas were still just paper parks, meaning they only had a name on a map and had no staff or operating budget. With no other choice, the Forestry Ministry encouraged nature reserves to, and this is a quote, rationally open up utilization, develop your own industries, and increase reserves' ability for self-accumulation and self-development. Now, the ministry also said that these activities shouldn't interfere with the conservation mission of the parks, but in practice, this was very difficult to enforce. Of course, there's a Chinese saying, heaven is high and the emperor is far away, which basically means, you know, you can get away with a lot if you're a long way from the capital. Inside nature reserves, the reserve managers opened the floodgates to a whole set of different economic and extractive activities like logging, mining, and fish farming. One of the main buzzwords of this time, of course, was ecotourism. The idea that, you know, people like these who want to see nature will pay for it, and you can use that money to fund conservation. But developing tourism either failed or it succeeded too well and attracted so many people that their pressure on natural habitats became unbearable. One Chinese researcher claimed that the pressure on the forest from tourism in the famous Wolong Panda Reserve, including things like garbage, air and water pollution, road construction, fuel wood collection, collection of wild plants and animals for restaurants, was actually doing more damage to the forest than the logging company that had been managing the forest before it became a protected area. Unfortunately, foreign NGOs sometimes contributed to this idea of nature reserves going into tourism or other businesses to help cover their costs. And I can say from her firsthand experience that there were many failed international NGO ecotourism projects around China at this time. The fiscal crisis of protected areas didn't start to ease really until the 2010s. But in the 1990s, some localities began experimenting with some new financing mechanisms. In parts of southeastern China, wealthier cities downstream started compensating upstream communities for maintaining and protecting forests to protect water sources and reduce flooding. This payment for environmental services approach would become more and more important in China in the future. A huge shift happened in the philosophy and behavior of the Chinese government toward nature in 1998. There were some signs that it was coming earlier than that. Payment for environmental services experiments were certainly one example. The idea that it was important for China's economic development to protect upstream forests was something that was becoming more and more widely accepted. At the same time, Professor Li Jinchang, a resource economist, did a study of China's logging industry and estimated that China's natural forests would be completely gone within 7 or 8 years at the prevailing rate of cutting, and that reforestation campaigns had been so ineffective that there would be about a 10-year period after that before young forests would become mature enough to harvest. The World Bank also had commissioned some studies that found a connection between deforestation in upstream areas and floods in downstream areas. A leader of no less fame and power than Prime Minister Zhu Rongji, on a tour of the upper Yangtze Valley, said, "We must invite the forest tiger to come down from the mountain," which is a very nice poetic Chinese way of saying large state-owned logging companies are inefficient and environmentally harmful, and we will be closing them down and retraining their workforce. Now, the Three Gorges Dam had been completed in 1997 and was meant to be a safeguard against major floods, but critics claimed that it really couldn't protect from large floods, especially in the middle and lower Yangtze, because there were just too many tributaries joining the river downstream of the dam. And in the summer of 1998, the rain started and just wouldn't stop. The floods along the entire Yangtze River Valley were massive. It's estimated that the economic losses were about $40 billion and over 4,000 people died. In response, the whole shift in approach toward its policies toward nature happened much more rapidly, and the Chinese government banned all logging in the entire Yangtze River watershed immediately. Over the next few years, China implemented a huge program and paid tens of millions of farmers, a total of, I believe, 14 billion US dollars, so that farmers living in mountain areas would plant trees instead of crops on their steeply sloping hillsides. And in arid areas, the government paid farmers to allow farmland to go fallow so that natural grasslands could recover. Something a little bit like some of the agricultural programs we have in the United States for resting farm fields. They moved thousands of farmers out of flood-prone lowlands along the Yangtze that then became flood storage basins. And overnight, the mission of the entire forestry ministry in China was changed from logging to restoration and protection. All of this began in the summer and fall of 1998. And at the end of that year, all of this began in the summer and fall of 1998. And at the end of that year, I was fortunate enough to be hired as the new country representative in China for the World Wildlife Fund. In hindsight, I feel so lucky because the years I was with WWF in China were sort of the golden age of environment and conservation in China. The government that had been so conservative, that had not really been able to afford to fund protected areas, and that had argued that as a developing country, China should really develop its economy first and think about the environment later. That government was all of a sudden taking these radical steps to restore natural ecosystems and was also open to listening to new ideas. They knew that things were going wrong and they needed to try new things. I think part of the reason that they were so willing to listen was that so many of the new ideas about how to better manage and be stewards of the environment were coming from Chinese people. Foreign NGOs, including WWF, had used almost exclusively Western staff in China in the 1980s and 1990s. But when I started my job, I found that there was a whole new generation of idealistic, cosmopolitan, brilliant young Chinese scholars and scientists. Many of them had gotten degrees abroad at some of the finest universities in the West, and they wanted to come back and help China. And I just felt so fortunate to be able to hire and work with these people. I actually had a policy of only hiring Chinese people to work for WWF China because I really felt that there was no reason to spend more for expatriates when you could find such amazing talent inside the country. Because instead of bringing Western assumptions about how government or economies work, these people understood the way Chinese bureaucracies functioned and understood the rationale for different decisions the government was making. They were able to look at these big state programs and find ways to piggyback onto them and add value to them and help improve their implementation. It was really just so inspiring to be around our office and hear people on the phone saying, this nature reserve, we can provide $20,000 for staff training and another $10,000 for equipment. If you can increase the status of this reserve to state level, because the state level reserve will have stronger enforcement, and our studies indicate that it's between two other areas, very important habitat areas that we want to protect. So we want to build a sort of a habitat corridor in this area. They had senior officials in the Ministry of Forestry on speed dial and were able to really add a lot and contribute a lot to efforts that the Chinese government was making to extend protection for wildlife and natural habitats. This guy is Liu Xiaohai, a young man who came to work for WWF in about the year 2000 or 2001. He had been an entrepreneur working in organic agriculture, but decided that he really wanted to make a contribution to conservation in his home province of Shanxi, and where earlier ecotourism had been and economic development programs had been very sort of ham-fisted and had been run by people who actually didn't understand business. He combined his business acumen with a very deep commitment to working with local communities to understand what their capacities and needs were. So this is He has his arm on a beehive, and I'm sure he's being careful, but he worked with a local community in the Qinling Mountains to develop an organic honey business, so that they could, without having to go into the forest to cut firewood or hunt or trap, they were able to make more money and maintain their lives in the mountains in a more sustainable way. And the thing about these projects is they also were very good for relations between communities and protected area staffs, which oftentimes were seen as very adversarial. Anyway, Xiaohai was just one of dozens of just amazing, smart and idealistic young Chinese conservationists that I had the privilege to work with during this time. We had a website that started out just as many websites were at the time, sort of like our annual report online, very static. But we hired some young, dynamic people who, understood how this new social media might work. And they immediately said, we need to reach out to young people in China because there's a growing interest in nature and people want to be able to talk to each other about what they're seeing when they go out for hikes. And so at the time, it was all about bulletin boards. Remember bulletin boards, the BBS functions? And we set up a bulletin board in Beijing for bird watchers in Beijing. But all of a sudden, we had requests from all over the country saying, well, we want a bulletin board so that we can have chats in Shanghai and in Xi'an and in Guangzhou, because we're organizing trips and we want to compare our bird lists and share photos and stories, and also sort of coordinate our activities with each other. And it just took off. Young people and China's new middle class were at a point where they were starting to get interested in nature in new ways. They were starting to have the time and the disposable income to do so. And whereas just a few years earlier, when I went birding, I went with a few Chinese ornithologist friends. We sensed that this was a new area of interest in Chinese society, but that might be a way to persuade more of China's new middle class to really show concern for nature. And so we decided to translate a new field guide to the birds of China, which was written by John McKinnon and published by Oxford University Press, to translate that into to Chinese and make it available at a more reasonable price for ordinary Chinese people. The English language version of this book costs about 60 euro. And that was way beyond the means of ordinary Chinese at this time. And so what we did was subsidize the printing so that it could be about the equivalent of about $10 US to get this book. And we didn't really know what would happen, but it sold out immediately and went into printing after printing. And between this kind of organizing, providing a space where people could organize themselves online and providing resources like the field guide, we were able to really contribute to the takeoff of birding and birding groups. There were eventually things like bird watching. Eventually, more groups took this on, and there became local bird clubs around the country and birding festivals and competitions. When I was traveling to China last December, back when we could first travel internationally, when we could still travel internationally, I was invited to maybe the 15th or 16th bird festival in Yueyang. And the first one had been organized by WWF way back in the early 2000s. But it has become a huge event there and has helped convince the local government that protecting wildlife is something that is a way to sort of put their city on the map. Now, when I say that we were active in doing things like supporting birding in China. I have to say, we didn't invent Chinese birdwatching or promote it single-handedly. The other exciting thing about this time was that China's middle class was really coming into its own, and tens of millions of people, if not hundreds of millions of people, were realizing that there was more to life than just making money. And you saw the emergence of a Chinese civil society with environmental concerns, especially among the urban middle classes. This gentleman is Mr. Liang Congjie. He came from a very famous family in China. His father had actually pleaded with Mao Zedong not to tear down Beijing's city wall. He pleaded in vain, but he became sort of a cultural hero for that when Beijingers regretted that that decision had been made. And Liang Congjie decided in the early 1990s that China was ready for its first environmental NGO. So he started a group called Friends of Nature. Friends of Nature started out as very much an organization that organized nature outings and birdwatching trips. But over time, Liang was very strategic in picking out issues to work on where he could push the envelope a little bit to try to encourage more government action on behalf of the environment. And one of the first big campaigns that Friends of Nature was involved in had to do with the Tibetan antelope that I talked about earlier, the species that was almost wiped out on the Tibetan plateau during the 80s and 90s. Friends of Nature started sending teams of volunteers up to document what was happening and to raise awareness and get the media talking about the issue and make it sort of a patriotic problem. They also raised money to provide equipment to the beleaguered anti-poaching staff that were working in the huge nature reserves in Northwest China at that time. And I think their activism really did play a part in strengthening enforcement and bringing more official attention to the problem until by the early 2000s, it was estimated that the antelope's population had recovered and the herd was over 100,000 and headed up toward 150,000. So it was a real success story, and it's an example of the kinds of issues that even in an authoritarian political system, savvy environmentalists could pick and choose and actually find ways to make a difference. Indeed, in addition to the Tibetan antelope, during this period, there seemed to be a noticeable recovery of nature and wild species in many areas. You know, more effective protection in protected areas often meant that species of things like bears and monkeys recovered to the point where, and wild pigs as well, to the point where they started leaving protected areas and eating the crops of nearby farmers. So whereas a complete lack of any wildlife in forests was the major problem in China during the 1980s and early 1990s, by the early 2000s, you actually had a situation where human-wildlife conflict, as a result of the very success of protection efforts, was becoming a bigger and bigger issue in protected areas. Now, part of this was due to better enforcement, as I mentioned, and new policies, but part of it was also just due to urbanization. You know, historians tell us that there's now much more forest in the eastern US than there has been in 300 years. And that's because even though there's many times more people than there were ever before, there are also, almost all of those people are in large cities. So forests have had a chance to grow back. Something similar has happened in rural areas all over China. As China's population became more and more urbanized, many rural areas were abandoned or had much lower population density than they had before. In 2018, I went back for the first time to a village where I had done some crane research in 1988, and I found that the surrounding farm fields that I remembered had all grown up into forests. But better protection of biodiversity inside of China, unfortunately, coincided with a huge increase in China's environmental footprint elsewhere. China, which had been an exporter of many illegal wildlife products during the 1980s and 90s, became a net importer of wild fish and seafood, forest and timber products, as well as wildlife species like pangolins and tigers. And as China's demand for food increased, its imports of agricultural products became a key driver of deforestation on other continents. China now imports 2/3 of all of the soybeans traded on global markets. And about half of those come from Brazil, grown on land that used to be rainforest. As this slide shows, in just 5 years, from 2000 to 2005, 4 million hectares of rainforest were converted to soy production in Brazil. And China is second only, and about half of Brazil's, and about half of China's soy imports come from Brazil. China is also second only to India in its imports of palm oil, which is grown on land that was formerly tropical forest, especially in Indonesia and Malaysia. The final period I want to talk about in the recent history of wildlife conservation in China is the period from 2012 to the present that coincides with Xi Jinping, pictured here, taking over as China's supreme leader. And the statement, the Chinese characters you see on the screen, 绿水青山就是金山银山, translate as green mountains and blue waters are like mountains of silver and gold. In case there's any doubt of what he meant when he said this, he also said, we value both natural landscapes and resources, as well as material wealth. The former overrides and promises the latter. So once again, we're moving from this very extractive development first and economic growth first philosophy to really saying that human welfare is very much tied up with having a healthy environment and functioning natural ecosystems. Currently, about 18% of China's national territory is under some form of protected status. There are 2,750 nature reserves, and they're much better financed than they were back in the old days. Some endangered species have shown signs of recovery. The giant panda status was actually recently changed from endangered to vulnerable because surveys found that its population has continued to increase. The Amur tiger also has seen increases in its population. And of course, I mentioned the crested ibis and Tibetan antelope, but also the Yangtze alligator, which is the only alligator, the only other alligator aside from the American alligator on the planet. Now, in addition to prohibitions on hunting and trapping of endangered wildlife, China has also instituted seasonal fishing bans on the Yangtze, on the Huai River, and on several other major rivers, as well as in much of its territorial marine waters. China also continues to make progress in restoring its forest and grassland cover. And in place of the old tree planting campaigns, different types of payment for ecological service schemes have become important mechanisms for channeling government funds to environmentally sensitive areas and rewarding local communities and farmers who maintain things like natural vegetative cover. And a new set of so-called ecological red lines are also designed to protect the environment outside of nature reserves through functional zoning. For instance, polluting industries are going to actually be banned altogether from constructing plants within 1 kilometer of the Yangtze River and its major tributaries. And existing plants are going to be required to relocate to designated industrial development zones. China has also invested some of its new wealth in financing its protected areas system more fully. When I worked in nature reserves in the 1980s, staff usually consisted of laid-off loggers with little equipment or training in conservation. Returning to some of those same nature reserves in the past 5 years, I've been stunned to find young staff with graduate degrees in biology or forestry using state-of-the-art camera traps and remote sensing technology. And a couple of years ago, while hiking in the hills outside of Beijing, I ran into this. I'm going to try to play a video, so bear with me. Just a second. Believe me, this is going to be worth the wait. What the loudspeakers were saying. So this is a motion activated, solar powered alarm. And when people walk on the path that enters this park, there's an announcement that says, "Hello, you are entering a first category protected forest of the municipality of Beijing. The forest police remind you to, there's no smoking and we need to protect our forests. Thank you and have a nice day." And then there's further instructions here. So this is just an example of the lengths that conservation agencies in China are going to try to protect forests and other habitats. It's pretty wild stuff. All right, having a few of the small problems that Joan said we might have, but hoping that you can hear me, I will now continue. Unfortunately, despite the progress that's been made, biodiversity losses continue in China, and freshwater systems are especially vulnerable and especially damaged. The giant paddlefish, the giant Yangtze paddlefish has gone extinct, and this is the baiji, a freshwater dolphin that went extinct in 2007, I believe. It's the first dolphin to actually go extinct at the hand of humans. Unfortunately, there are still many endangered plants and animals, especially plants and animals that have value in traditional Chinese medicine. There's been a lot of publicity about the pangolin, which is used in traditional medicine. They're pretty much wiped out inside of China, and there are a lot of problems also with imports. Actually, over half of China's reptile species and about 45% of its amphibians are endangered. More importantly for human beings is a huge decline in the wild populations, not only of medicinal plant species, but also in the genetic diversity of domesticated animals and crops. China is the place where things like rice, soybeans, pigs and chickens, and many citrus fruits originated, where they originally developed, and where there were initially hundreds, if not thousands, of different varieties of these different animals and crops. but you know, modernization and homogenization of agriculture has meant the discarding and loss of much of that diversity. And because of historical damage to forests and rivers, combined with climate change, even recent programs that have been intended to restore forests and wetlands that I've talked about really haven't been able to prevent all natural disasters. And the flooding that's happening on the Yangtze this summer, as we speak, may actually be worse than the flooding that happened in 1998. Some are saying there may be $100 billion US worth of losses. Whoa. But the biggest challenge going forward may be outside of China, where the ecological footprint of China's demand for resources and its investments in big construction projects have global scale effects on species and ecosystems. China's Belt and Road Initiative involves major infrastructure investments in fragile and biodiversity-rich regions in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Africa. And there is a backlash against China because of its growing claims over natural resources around the world, from mines in Africa to soy imports from Brazil to armed fishing fleets that frequently trespass in other countries' territorial waters. And this is just some of the reporting on this issue just in the last couple of months, so you can get an idea of how widespread and deep some of this backlash is. Now, the fact is, all rising economic powers, including and especially the US, have done similar things in the past. But global norms around the environment have changed over the past few decades. And I hope that China's leadership find ways to work with other countries and multilateral bodies like the United Nations to ensure that the ecological civilization principles that are increasingly guiding its domestic policies can also be integrated into its outward trade and investment. Well, it's been a long journey from 1981 to the present. And if you're still with me, I'd like to open it up now for questions.
Thank you very much, Jim. What a fantastic presentation. And then thank you for everyone who come to this presentation. I know it's already 1 p.m. now, so for those of you who need to go, by all means, feel free to leave now, but we will be recording the entire presentation and the Q&A. So we will be sending you a link to the video so you can always come back and check for the rest of the presentation. Thanks a lot. And Jim, we have a lot of amazing questions coming in, so.
All right. If you'll turn on the question function, I'll take a look. Sorry that I went all the way to 1. I'm between my slideshow and my notes. Can
you see the Q&A now?
I wasn't keeping my eye on the clock. Excuse me?
Can you see the questions now?
I cannot.
Oh,
yes, I can. Yeah. Yes, I can. Let me see. Well, one question is, are there private or NGO-based efforts in China like the Nature Conservancy here in the United States? Shall I answer that one? Mm-hmm. You know, the political space for NGOs in China is much smaller and more constrained than it is here. And so Friends of Nature certainly is an example of one of the really preeminent conservation organizations in China. There is an organization that actually learned a lot from and kind of grew out of the Nature Conservancy's China program called the Paradise Foundation. It's a Chinese foundation that was founded by Jack Ma, the famous tycoon, and is meant to use some of the approaches similar to the Nature Conservancy in terms of trying to organize sort of private management of protected areas and so forth. But it's a much, much smaller it's a much, much smaller component of conservation in China. The state really remains the main force for protecting the environment. Let me see. I lost my sound there. In the US, contact between humans and non-domesticated animals is rare. Is this different in China? I would say that, you know, there is certainly more contact in China. There, you know, the U.S. Moved away from a dependency or a strong interest in eating wild foods, including wild animals, some time ago. Whereas in China, a lot of those traditions are still pretty strong, and a lot of those tastes are still strong. And so the question of wild animals being held in wet markets to be sold to people, and the possibility of their serving as vectors for zoonotic diseases is certainly a reality. You know, this is something that has been known for a long time, and there is a fierce debate currently in China about how to properly regulate those kinds of markets. All right. Can you recommend books about Chinese environment and biodiversity conservation for entry-level reading? Well, actually, I haven't written a book, but I wrote an article about a survey of biodiversity conservation and forestry policy in China. It was in an academic journal called the China Quarterly in 1998 or 99, but it's actually a pretty easy read. And so if you want to just read one thing, that's a pretty good example. You know, there isn't one really good book to introduce the topic, but you know, online there is something called China Dialogue, which is a website that publishes stories in English and Chinese, and it translates all of its stories, and it organizes discussions between English-speaking and Chinese-speaking people to talk about issues like the environment. And they do an awful lot of coverage of wildlife and environmental conservation issues. So I would say going to China Dialogue would be a really good place to start. Let's see. Do you see any improvement for wildlife protection nowadays? And what is the most important factor for protecting wildlife? Well, you know, as I was saying, inside of China, I feel like wildlife protection, the effectiveness of wildlife protection has improved tremendously. And I think there are all sorts of reasons for that. Part of it really is just so many people have moved to cities that people aren't coming into contact with wildlife that often, and they're not necessarily dependent on hunting or trapping wildlife the way they used to be. Part of it is better enforcement, so that, you know, when I was able to hike through the mountains and see that panda, the entire day, the forest rangers who were with us kept finding snares, wire snares that had been left for musk deer, and other animals like pandas tended to step into those snares and get trapped, and you know, you could easily get an infection and die. You know, those things are much better enforced these days. So I think that there really have been tremendous improvements. And I think you know, a combination of awareness and enforcement, and frankly, you know, ensuring that people have decent living standards, so that they don't, you know, so that they don't see killing a wild animal as either a subsistence or an economic option that is attractive to them, right? And I think that that has really made a big difference in China.
Jim,
This is,
two more
yes?
questions. Maybe two more questions.
Yes, well, we have a question, the hard one. What do you think the outlook is for US and China working together on wildlife conservation, climate change, et cetera? And do you think NGOs and other organizations can overcome political challenges to cooperation? Well, you know, I certainly hope that the US and China can work together in all ways more closely. And it's vital to the future of the planet that we have leaders in both countries that understand the reality of climate change and are willing to work together on it. You know, I think that the current political environment certainly does not bode well for that kind of cooperation on a bilateral level. But I see that part of your question is really saying, are there things that NGOs can do in both countries to cooperate? And I think that that's you know, that's a very good question and a very good point. That you know, organizations in the United States like WWF and others certainly can still reach out to their colleagues in China at places like Friends of Nature and find ways that we can support each other. And, you know, keep lines of dialogue open in civil society, even as the official relationships get colder and colder. Let's see. Have non-native species been an issue in the reintroduction or recovery of wildlife? Well, I'm not 100% sure what that question is getting at, but certainly, you know, here in the United States, we're all familiar with things like Dutch elm disease or emerald ash borer or Asian carp. These different alien species that have entered the United States, you know, reform and opening by re-entering the global economy, China really opened itself up to the same kinds of problems. And I recently was reading of something like, you know, $20 or $25 billion a year in economic losses in China from agriculture because of invasive plant species that have come from abroad. I'm not sure what impacts those have on wildlife more broadly and on reintroduction of native species, but certainly China has the same sort of biosafety issues that the United States does in terms of, you know, how do you have international trade but not end up having unwanted species tag along and end up becoming a problem in your own country. So that's, it sounds like maybe all the questions we have time for during this session, but Haiyan knows how to reach me, and I would be happy to talk to people offline or answer your emails. It's really been a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you, and I'm glad that we were able to overcome a few little technological hitches. I'd like to really thank again Wang Haiyan and the China Center for making this possible, and I hope we have an opportunity to see each other again.
Thank you very much, Jim. This is a great presentation, and then thank you all for coming to the presentation. I'll forward Jim the rest of the questions, so if he wanted to answer that, he can contact you. Our next webinar will be on August 19th about traditional Chinese music with famous Chinese musician Gao Hong. So welcome to attending our next webinar. Thanks for coming. Bye now.
Bye, everyone.